All right, thanks. It was popping out in the distance. So last spring, we released the Get It Toolgether, Assessing Your Food Council's Ability to Do Policy Work Toolkit to help food policy councils assess their capacity to work on advocacy and provide them with appropriate resources to reach their strategic goals. Since this month's FPN theme centers around evaluation and monitoring, we thought it would be appropriate to highlight this toolkit and walk you through how it can be used to advance your council's efforts. Before we begin, I'll introduce the speakers and review the format of the webinar. The toolkit was adapted from Alliance for Justice Advocacy Capacity Tool. So we have invited Abby Levine, who serves as the Director of Alliance for Justice's Bolder Advocacy program, to share her insights. Abby provides training and technical assistance to advocates, would-be advocates, and grant makers that focus on how federal tax and election laws allow lobbying, ballot measures, and election-related activity for tax-exempt organizations. And of course, most of you know Ann Palmer, Program Director at the Johns Hopkins Center for Livable Future in the Bloomberg School of Public Health. Ann oversees the Food Policy Networks project and led the efforts to develop the toolkit. Also, in case anyone is unfamiliar with Zoom, let's briefly review the webinar platform we're using today. All attendees are muted and will remain in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. Today's discussion will be organized a bit differently. In lieu of the two presentations, we'll do Abby's presentation and then we'll return to Ann. And at the end, we'll do a question and answer session. At any point during the conversation, you can type a question or comment for the panelists or the audience into the chat box. You can open the chat box by clicking the chat icon in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen, which we were having trouble finding. So if you're having trouble finding it, you have to scroll to the top of your screen and hold for a few seconds or the bottom of your screen. You can also choose who you talk to by clicking the gray More button in the bottom right-hand corner of the chat box. Finally, we'll be recording the webinar today, and we'll send out a link to the video in a PDF of the slides afterwards. Now, before I hand it over to the panelists, I want to explain who we are. The Center for Livable Future is an interdisciplinary research center located at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Our work focuses on the intersection of diet, the environment, food production, and public health. The Food Policy Networks project is one of our projects. The goal of FPN is to build the capacity of food system stakeholders to reform local, state, regional, and tribal or First Nations food systems through effective public policy. We do that through training, sharing best practices, networking with other food policy groups and leaders, and developing and providing food policy resource materials. If you aren't familiar with the Food Policy Networks project, I encourage you to check out our website and to sign up for our listserv to hear more about future webinars hosted by FPN. And now, Abby, you can go ahead and start sharing your screen, and then we'll proceed to mute ourselves.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay and see my screen? Perfect. Well, it's really a pleasure to be with the Food Policy Networks today and to be working with Ann and Rachel and all of you to be presenting today's webinar. Advocacy is such an important topic for organizations and unfortunately such a misunderstood area. And it's something that too often creates fear and misunderstanding and this sense that it's not appropriate for organizations and for nonprofit organizations to be advocates. And what we really hope to be able to do today is to really demystify that and to really help you understand both why advocacy is so important for your work, but then really to get a sense of what does it take to be a successful advocate and what are the core capacities that organizations should have. And as Rachel mentioned, the tool that's in your toolkit, or the toolkit, is adapted from a tool that we created at Alliance for Justice many years ago at this point, our advocacy capacity tool. And that work and sort of our whole body of leadership around advocacy capacity and evaluation has been led by my colleague Sue Hochstetter, who has done a lot of writing and really a lot of thinking on this issue. And so most of what I'm going to be talking about today, I've learned from her and wanted to just give her that shout out. For those of you who are not familiar with us at Alliance for Justice, and particularly our Bolder Advocacy program, we work with nonprofits all across the country to really encourage organizations to be bolder advocates. That we think it's important for organizations like yours, and whether you're talking about issues of food insecurity or hunger and homelessness, or other types of economic policy, or whatever the issue is, that it's so important that you're at the table when decisions are being made. But we recognize that most people get involved in organizations because you care about the mission, you care about your community, not because you care about or you really want to spend time focused on some of the compliance issues. But understanding the compliance issues are really important to be able to maintain organizations' tax-exempt status, to be able to receive funding. And so we're here to really provide that behind-the-scenes support. And so on our website, we have a lot of different resources, including more resources on evaluation and advocacy capacity, as well as information on how 501c3 organizations can legally advocate for the policies that they care about. We also have a technical assistance line, and so if you have questions about what we talk about today, or really any other advocacy-related topic, you can contact us at any time. And that information will be provided in the slides and will be made available to you after today's webinar. And so we're really here as a resource. But as we really start thinking about the importance of advocacy and how you can measure your council's readiness to work on policy and systems change, we really want to start by delving into some of the language and to make sure that we have a common understanding of what we mean by advocacy and what advocacy is. And this is an area where there's a lot of different terminology that's used. And sometimes people use the word policy change, or sometimes people talk about advocacy. Sometimes people talk about systems change. Sometimes people talk about organizing or community organizing. And until we all have the same understanding of what we mean, it's really hard to have conversations within organizations and among staff and an organization, or talking to your members, talking to your volunteers, talking to your donors or trustees. It's about what you want to do and what you need to get ready. And so again, understanding the terminology can be really important. Now the screen in front of you shows a lot of different boxes with a lot of different types of activity, of everything from educating the public, to doing research, to influencing regulations, to litigation, to encourage voting, to changing corporate behavior. All of these are types of advocacy. Advocacy is one of those terms that does not have a precise legal meaning. It's really about influencing the development and implementation of public policy, or sometimes corporate policy. So if you're trying to encourage soda companies or Coca-Cola not to create healthier beverages, or for instance, that would be a type of corporate public policy or corporate policy change. So there are a lot of different types of activity that fit within the advocacy rubric. What's really important, and one of the biggest misperceptions, is the notion that all advocacy is lobbying. And what, again, we hope to show from this screen is that while lobbying is a type of advocacy, advocacy is much broader than lobbying. And we at Alliance for Justice and through our Bolder Advocacy program do many, many, many other trainings where we really dive into what do we mean by lobbying and how does it differ from other types of advocacy. And we're not going to do that on this training, but if you have questions, please feel free to raise them. But essentially, for purposes of us as 501c3 organizations, lobbying is trying to influence specific pieces of legislation, something that needs to be voted on by a legislative body, a bill, a resolution, or a ballot measure. Those are types of lobbying. All other types of policy, whether researching issues or finding out what people in a community want, or organizing communities to be able to speak out on behalf of to raise their concerns, or engaging in litigation, or building relationships with legislators, those may not actually be lobbying. And so again, it's important as we think about terminology to recognize that advocacy is much broader than lobbying. And that's important because 501c3 organizations are limited in how much lobbying we can do. And for those of you who receive federal funds, you know that you are not allowed to use federal funds for lobbying. But again, that doesn't mean we need to stay quiet in terms of talking about issues that we care about and talking about issues of food policy, food security. That there is a difference between talking about the need for everybody in this country to have access to healthy food to saying we need to reauthorize the Farm Bill and we need these provisions to be in the bill. So there is a big difference between advocacy and lobbying. And as 501c3 organizations, we can do some lobbying as long as we have unrestricted funds that we can use for it. And again, government funds are not allowed to be used for lobbying. As 501c3 organizations, we are also prohibited from supporting or opposing candidates for public office. So we can't endorse candidates. We can't oppose candidates. We can, however, talk to candidates. We can encourage people to register to vote. There's a lot that we can do during elections. There's a lot that we can do to raise awareness of our issues. And again, we have lots of resources on that, and we're happy to talk with you after today's webinar about those areas. But again, want to just be really clear that advocacy really is this broad array of activities. And as we think about advocacy, it's important to recognize too that we also want to think about it in terms of the systems through which advocacy is conducted. And that advocacy happens at all levels of government as well. At federal level, so whether you're trying to influence Congress or the work through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or working at the state level or the local level. And sometimes organizations may even try to work internationally, whether you're working in a particular region of the world or maybe trying to influence UN policy, that advocacy can happen at all levels of government. And in many cases, we have different targets of who we're trying to influence. And we've broken them down sort of into these 6 major categories. Administrative advocacy, which is where we're really trying to weigh in and change policy or educate folks in the executive branch of government, state agencies, possibly the mayor's office, the Federal Department of Environmental Protection. And at the agencies develop regulations to implement legislation, provide oversight for the implementation. And a lot of the work that gets done in terms of policy work is really done through the executive branch at this administrative level. That's often where the rubber really meets the road, and that implementation phase is key. And there's so much that as organizations we can do at the administrative level. For reasons that I've never quite understood, often legislative advocacy seems to get all the attention. And often when I'm doing trainings and I ask people, what are you trying, who do you want to influence, or who do you need to talk to about the issue that you care about? People tend to go to Congress or tend to think of their state legislature. And sometimes we do need to have a bill passed, and sometimes that's where funding comes from, or the only way for the policy change that we want is through legislative action. But again, even if we do need to work on getting a bill passed or sometimes trying to prevent legislation from passing, the bill is only as good as the implementation. And so again, oftentimes legislative work tends to overshadow much of the other work, and it's important to think about all of these different avenues. Sometimes, however, it may not be our government officials that are the ones that can actually provide the change. And sometimes it's us, the public, or us, the voters, that can do that. And that's where we work through ballot measures, or in some states are referred to as referenda, or it may be a tax levy, or a constitutional amendment, or a referenda initiative, and for federal tax purposes, these are often considered to be lobbying activities. But in many cases, and as we've seen over the last few years, there's been a real uptick in the number of ballot measures where it's being put to the public to really weigh in on what they think should happen. And so that's an area that, while not every organization gets involved in, it's something to keep in mind and to recognize that there are different ways and different levels to get involved in ballot measure work. And of course, to recognize that some states, particularly those out west, Oregon, California, Colorado, have a lot of ballot measures where some of the states in the South and the East Coast don't. Litigation is another advocacy strategy or another target that tends to be a fairly small group of organizations that embark on litigation. But again, over the last few years, I think I've seen more and more groups start getting involved. And that could either be as a plaintiff, of bringing suit, of filing a court case, challenging the constitutionality of a law, or suing to stop somebody from taking action. Or it could be, as we at Alliance for Justice do more often, maybe participate in ongoing litigation by submitting a friend of the court brief or an amicus brief. And then finally, there is corporate advocacy, as we talked about, and whether it's trying boycotts that are aimed at particular companies, or whether it's, again, weighing in with different corporations to get them to change their internal business practices. And sometimes that can be a very effective advocacy strategy. And many groups do not engage in all of these different targets. And one of the things is we've provided in our capacity tools is that to really encourage groups to look at all of the targets. And in many cases, not that every group should be doing them, but just so you have a sense and to recognize and to keep in mind that there may be targets out there beyond the ones that you tend to be engaged in. And that it's important to think about, from time to time, do you want to sort of stretch your legs and maybe experiment with a different strategy, or are there other work that other groups are doing that can complement the work that you're doing? And so again, it's good to know all of what's going on and to be able to have a sense of how holistically you may be able to get the policy change that you want. And as we've been talking about advocacy, we also want to talk a little bit about sort of a sister approach to advocacy, which is community organizing. And again, these are terms, advocacy and organizing, that some people, like me, used to use interchangeably. And I really thought they were the same, or they were just sort of euphemisms for each other. But as I've learned from many of the groups that we've worked with and my colleagues, that community organizing and advocacy are not the same. They're both about social change, but they, at their core, have differences in what they're meant to do. And to recognize that it's a continuum and that different organizations, again, have different definitions and may be defining these differently. But as we look at it, and as from talking to a number of groups, that for advocacy, while there may be a big focus on engaging and mobilizing constituents, it may be finding out what members want and making sure that all policies are consistent with members. The main focus really is on policy change or sometimes policy maintenance, trying to prevent change of the policy. And so, for instance, it may be that paid staff that are engaged in the policy work. Where community organizers, on the other hand, may often be working on policy change, but they're really focused on empowering their constituents. And it's often individuals, people from the community, often unpaid volunteers, and those who are most affected by the issue or the problem that are doing the work. And again, while getting a policy change, preventing getting a grocery store to come into a community, getting soda vending machines out of schools may be the target, the work is really about leadership development and building the tools of people in the community. And again, there's most organizations do a little bit of both, where it's both building power while trying to get a policy change. But in many cases, the community organizing groups, again, really see their main role is building the power and the leadership development, whereas advocacy groups are really about that policy change. And these don't happen in a vacuum. Advocacy and organizing need to work together. And in many cases, it's the people, it's the power of the people who can be the closers, who can be the ones who can make that policy change happen, who can provide the stories, can provide the faces. Where sometimes it's on the other hand, the advocates can come in and provide some of the detail or some of the more academic research or more of the familiarity with the process that can help the organizers sort of close the deal. And so in many cases, these are often seen as sort of sister methods, and many organizations, really integrate the two. Both organizing and advocacy are really essential. And again, it's important as you think about the work that you're doing to think about, where do you fall on that spectrum? And again, for some organizations, and as they talk about the work, being really clear about what end of the spectrum they're on, where other organizations sort of really look at an integrated approach. But regardless of whether you're thinking about advocacy as your main strategy or organizing as your main strategy, it's really important that we think about how do we build our capacity. And again, capacity is one of those terms that is used a lot and has become a real buzzword and this jargon word where different people use it differently. And when we think about capacity, we're not looking at what has been accomplished. It's not looking at what is your success in policy change. We're really looking at what is your readiness for action. And it could be your readiness for advocacy. It could be your readiness for organizing. But again, there is often a lot of confusion about and sort of combining and collapsing the need to build capacity with what is the work that's been done on a campaign. And while they're important, and in many cases you need capacity before you can have a success, before you can have a policy change, and we usually think that we need to have and build our capacity and have strong capacity to be able to accomplish the actual policy goals or the capacity, the organizing goals that we want. It's sometimes there's no clear line between the two, and sometimes organizations, and you may see that that organizations that you work with that may have no capacity at all, but they're still able to get a bill passed, and you're like, well, what happened? Or on the flip side, there are organizations, and it may be you or some of the partners that you work with that have so much expertise and have spent a lot of time really honing what their message is, and have done a lot of message development, and have built a lot of relationships with policymakers. And you think, well, but they haven't had success in terms of getting a bill passed. And that's part of the nature of advocacy, that advocacy really is, because it's so long-term, because so much of the nature of advocacy is outside of our control, because it's based on, it's other people. It's often based on the economy. It's based on sort of outside factors, that there's so much we can't control. But again, the one thing that we can control is our own capacity, our own readiness to advocate. And what we can do is really work to build up our capacity. And it's important, as we think about that capacity, to include both our organizational skills, our resources, our knowledge, our practices. And again, without capacity, the advocacy and organizing work cannot be done. And the first step in building a stronger organization is really getting a clear picture of what's needed to be effective. What are those capacities that you may need? And again, that's where these tools come into play. And that's where we at Alliance for Justice have developed our advocacy capacity tools. And we have our full ACT, and we have a short version of it, ACT Quick. We have an international version. And then we have a tool for community organizing, Power Check. And we'll have a Power Check Quick soon as well as these tools in Spanish. But again, it's important that these tools, and as you're looking at building your capacity, that it's really looking at building that capacity for the type of work that you're in. And that's why Anne and her team have really adapted sort of the version that we have into the toolkit for you. And I will now turn it over to her so she can really talk more about the particular tool and the ways that you can use it to build your capacity.
Thanks, Abby. That was great. And I'm going to spend a few minutes. I mean, we did take the original, their toolkit, and then adapt it, as Abby said. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we started to think about our work, given that we are working with mostly with food policy councils. So we took what we call the policy windows theory, and this is a theory by John Kingdon. And what it looks at is what are the conditions under which policy happens. And I think the policy windows theory essentially says you have to have two of these three factors in place in order for policy to happen. So one of them is that the problem has to be identified by policy makers as important and solvable. The policies have to have potential solutions that are feasible and affordable and reflect values and really kind of look at what's needed in the community. And then finally, it's politics. Who's in office? What's the political climate? The influence of the opposition. And so if two of those three are in effect, then the opportunities for changing a policy are much greater. And so we look at what we call these windows. And I think this is where it can get kind of, it's a little tricky to figure out. You know, you come into a space and you may have a strategy in place, but oftentimes the strategy can't be executed because you don't have all, those factors aren't necessarily lining up. So you might have a couple of different strategies in place, and there's an opportunity perhaps to tee up a policy that had been kind of languishing in the background, and because there's some event that happened, you sort of seize that opportunity. And I think we had a little experience with this when Baltimore released their community resilience plan, and that all of a sudden, there was a lot of press around it, but then Hurricane Harvey happened, and then all of a sudden there was even more interest in it. And it was because there was an event that triggered an opportunity to work on a policy that people probably hadn't considered as important before until there was something that was sort of right in front of them. So look at what your situation is and think about those three things to kind of decide how do you, what policies do you perhaps have the best opportunity to advocate for. So I'm going to just talk briefly about what's in the toolkit, and then we're going to walk through one of the sections. And so I won't read this, but we cover the organizational assessment piece of it. This was actually based on Larissa Clancy's dissertation data that some of you may have done that, her evaluation, her self-evaluation that she created, and that's still available. And so Larissa helped us adapt that for the first part of the toolkit. The second part is advocacy goals, plans, and strategies. And that's the piece that I'm going to walk through with you all live. We'll do this on so you can kind of see what it looks like. And then there is a section on conducting advocacy. And this really is a lot of what Abby covered and what she talked about in terms of how do you make decisions about how you're going to do advocacy, how do you build the capacity of the members of your particular coalition or council, and what kind of a strategy do you need to adapt. The last three sections, advocacy avenues, goes into the organization's skills, knowledge, and actions. And that again goes back to what Abby was talking about in terms of the different types of policy. We have a very broad definition of policy, so we'll cover administrative, institutional, and legislative. And then organizational operations to sustain advocacy. It is, there are certainly, these are evolving. All of us, I think it's healthy that people evolve and that those organizations that we're involved with also evolve. And it's based on what's going on at the time. So I think that there are ways to sustain your work and practices that we can encourage. And we want to kind of tee up some ideas about how you can build your capacity for that. And then finally, last section is policy implementation, which gets a little bit into the process of formation and enactment. And then there's kind of a laundry list of ideas of outputs and outcomes that you can consider. So those are not necessarily scored. That just is sort of a way to indicate if you've worked in those particular areas. So at the end, you will get, when you do this, if you decide to use it, you'll get a score. So okay, so do you want to, this is the section we're going to do. Rachel's give us a minute here. We're going to tee up the live.
Oh, okay. So I guess when I hit escape, it went to stop screen sharing, but okay. That's okay.
Yeah, so hey, hang on and we'll get it. We'll
want to be able to get to there.
We'll open this up live and then
it's like it won't.
And so what happens is, I'll just kind of walk you guys through this before we even get it pulled up. But basically, we'll get the toolkit up. And when you go online, there are a set of demographic questions that you will answer. And those questions are the same no matter what. And then you get asked, what sections do you want to do? And the sections can be, you can choose to do all of them. We have had a number, about 10 different groups pre-tested, and it takes about an hour to do all of them. Or you can just pick what sections you want to work on and not do the entire thing, and then it's much shorter. We've had groups actually have different members or team leaders go ahead and if you have work groups, those people can do it, and then they might have a little more in-depth knowledge about what it is that they're working on. And I think we're ready to go. Okay, so this is what it looks like right in the front when you come to it.
And just so you know, to get there, you just go to the Food Policy Network's resource database and type in Toolkit, and then you can click on the Get It Together, because the Qualtrics link is not very user-friendly.
Yeah. All right, here we go. All right, so I'm going to type in, I'll try and do this quick because I know this is not the most interesting part. Our Food Policy Council. And you also, it is possible to we can collect all the answers from the different groups of the, different members. If you have several different members doing it, we can collect them all and give them back to you too. So how many members do you have? How many forum members? Oops. How many people regularly participate? We'll say 3. Who are the primary? Me. Is this a leadership? Yes, it is a leadership, we'll say. And we'll just say that we're an informal group and our budget is between 0 and 10,000. And this is just for us to kind of get a sense for what the groups are that are doing this. And I'm going to say we're working on procurement and healthy food access. Early stages, yes. We facilitated, no. And what levels do you engage? And this is, we could say local and state. A lot of times people are working on both because they need to understand some of the state policy issues now in order to work on the local. And then we're going to go to the advocacy goals, plans, and strategies. So I click that. I'm not going to click the rest of them. And then we start answering the questions. So I'll go through this. I'm going to go through a couple, but you'll get a sense for what it is we're looking for. And these are the response categories are very strong or always, moderately strong, usually, somewhat strong, not strong at all, rarely or never. And then there's a non-applicable for this section as well. So in some of the sections, there is another category called relies on partners. And that score is not calculated in it, but it's a really important thing to recognize because there isn't a need for each group to do everything. Oftentimes, especially in policy arena, you may be endorsing another group's policy rather than doing your own. And so just recognize that's not considered a weakness, that there just isn't a way to calculate it. So if I say, okay, the first question is the organization identifies and articulates its vision, mission, and goals among its members. I'm going to say that's moderately strong or usual. So that would get a 2 on the scoring. So very strong equals 3, moderate 2, somewhat strong is 1, and not strong at all is 0. So when you get that score calculated at the end, that just gives you some frame of reference for how we did the scoring. And this is based on Alliance for Justice's scoring indicators. So but again, don't think of this as like A, B, C. This is really just an intention to try and give you some numerical information. The organization has a policy advocacy priorities, either as part of their food plan or an overall strategy. I'm going to say sometimes. We'll go through these kind of quick. The organization understands the overall policy environment related to its priorities, somewhat. The organization has basic knowledge about its policy subject matter, including how local, state, tribal function, how those governments function, somewhat. Then we're going to go into the agenda. So indicators that introduce the importance of having a clear, relevant agenda that define food policy goals, prioritize activities, and reflects community needs. So the first one is organization has conducted a scan of food and agricultural policies relevant to its jurisdiction within the last 4 years. So we haven't done that, so I'm going to say no, right? I mean, you could say not applicable, but no is probably fine too. It gathers information about recommendations from constituents and other stakeholders. Sort of, not sometimes, but not often. Organization regularly provides opportunities to hear about food-related issues from community members who are not on the council. We do that pretty well, but not all the time. The organization partners with community groups to increase and promote community engagement in local decision-making, particularly in low-income and marginalized neighborhoods. Somewhat, not great, but we do it sometimes. And then the organization has considered how the proposed policy agenda will impact socially disadvantaged and marginalized groups. And so that we're going to say somewhat too. So these are all kind of educational in nature, as you're getting a sense probably that this is the idea is that these are desired behaviors, and it's to kind of trigger that, oh, that's something we should consider. So it's actually a learning tool as well. And then finally, the last section is this indicators that address the importance of developing a flexible plan to carry out policy priorities. So this is going to be policy priorities. Who has the power to make decisions in legislative, administrative, and electoral? This is somewhat or sometimes. And then I'll just kind of go through these quickly. Develops. I'm going to go this, and then we're going to say this because we want to have more time. So here's my score. So if you had checked all the sections and you did them all, you'd get a score for each of those. This just tells you, since we only did section 2, our score for preparation was 7 out of 12. The food policy agenda was 5 out of 15, so an area we can probably work on. Didn't do so great in plan strategies and adaptability, but that's an area, again, where you can say, okay, what do we need to do? And then this is the total score, 14 out of 39. So I'm going to hit next. Now, I won't go to my email, but what happens is that as soon as you submit, and you would get an email back that would give you your scores, the total scores again, and it would also provide you a list of resources for each of those sections that help build your capacity in that area. And it almost is question for question. There were not always resources for every question, but the idea was to say, okay, and a lot of these are not like super complicated or long resources. They're supposed to be very user-friendly, but the intention really is to give people say, okay, now if we want to work on this, what are we going to do to improve it? And it is to really really to make sure those resources align with what you're interested in improving your scores, where you're interested in improving your scores. And I think that is.
Should we go back to Abby now?
Yeah, Abby, I think you are up next. Is that right? And we'll stop.
Yes. If you are done, I will go back. Great. One of the things, as we think about these tools, and as Anne just walked through the toolkit, is to recognize that of what these tools can do and what they can't do. And even though you get a score, and as you saw the scores, and you may say, oh, we have 5 out of 15 or 2 out of 18. These are not meant to be a letter grade. It's not meant to be a sign of success or failure. What these are to do is to help you identify your strengths and your gaps. And having that identification can help you in many different ways. It can help you figure out what part of a campaign you may be well positioned to undertake. If you're sitting around, if you find that you go through the tool and that you don't have and you sort of look at your capacity, your communications capacity, and you find that you don't have staff, you don't have an email list, you don't really have a good sense of who a base to communicate to. If you're sitting around with other partners and they're saying, okay, we need to divvy up tasks, we need to figure out who can do what to move this along so everybody's not stepping on each other's shoes, if you know that you don't have strong capacity in communications, that may not be the place where you raise your hand and say, hey, we'll take this on. But it can also help you, having that information, know that if you don't have the capacity in a particular area, and that may be a place to look for additional partners or somebody who can come and join the table. And as Anne said, not every organization needs to have every capacity. And in many cases, doing so may be a big waste of resources. And as you know, there aren't enough resources to go around. We don't have the time and the luxury for everybody to be an expert on everything or to be able to have the staff to do everything. And so how do we partner well together? How do we essentially play well in the sandbox? And what can each of us bring? And so the more we know and can help, and again, have this shared terminology about what our strengths are and what our gaps are, the better we can find other partners that we can work with. And for some areas, for instance, recognizing that research and having statistics about the number of people in your region, in your community that don't have access to regular meals, or sort of how many people are on different government programs. That may be something that your organization can't do, but one of the Kids Count groups or the state priority partner group as part of the Center on Budget, they may have that data. And so why should you spend time recreating it? You can also think about, as you look at your strengths and weaknesses, as you're talking to funders and thinking about how you want to grow as an organization. The information you may get from this tool can help you put in a proposal areas that you want to strengthen, and it may help you and give you ideas for what you may seek funding for. It may also help in terms of thinking about setting out your plans for the year of what's realistic. And the more you understand your current capacity, the more you can put out and set out plans that you think may actually be accomplishable based on what you have. So again, even if you go through this tool and find that your capacity is low in many areas, it's not something for you to say, oh my gosh, we're in trouble, or, oh, well, then we shouldn't even do advocacy at all. It's really to get a baseline of where you are now and recognize that every organization will be different, and by really having a good sense of where you are, that can really help you move forward. And so, again, it's not a grade. You don't want to look at this as a report card, but it's really to have a sense of where you are. And it also can be, and as I think Anne mentioned this as well, it could be a good vehicle for having a conversation within your organization, and maybe have different staff people or different volunteers take this and to have a sense of, is there a shared understanding? Do people have, do you each come out with very different scores? And then to have a conversation about what that means. And you may find that everybody has very different expectations of what success looks like or what strong capacity looks like. So again, there are a lot of different ways that you can use the tool, but again, it's meant to be something to help you sort of be strategic in your work and to really think about growing. Now, one of the areas where this can, and again, recognizing that one size does not fit all. Different organizations have very different approaches and it's important to figure out what makes sense for your organization and again, how you fit within the community. Now, when you might think about particularly evaluation and thinking about these kinds of assessments, you may look like this woman, which is what I often think about when somebody talks about evaluation, sort of this fear and uncertainty. And there often is a lot of uncertainty about, how do we measure success? And again, particularly when we're talking about advocacy, when we're talking about policy change, where policies may take years to be decided, or we may be one of many players that are working on a particular issue. When do we get to take credit for something? Or what if there's a hurricane that changes everything, or an election doesn't go the way we think it may, and there's a governor that is in office or a governor resigns? What do we do? But there's so much outside of our control. How do we really measure that? And so, of course, again, when we're thinking about evaluation, one piece that we really want to stress is that it's important, and as you're thinking about it, talking to funders and in proposals, that you're looking at success and you're looking at advocacy and organizing success, not just as actual policy change or policy outcomes, but you're also measuring enhanced capacity, and that you're looking at how have you built or strengthened your advocacy or organizing capacity during the grant period. And again, recognizing that there's so much in terms of advocacy that can make it difficult to say, well, if we do A, if we put money into or have staff work on this activity, we can't guarantee what the results will be. And that can be frustrating as opposed to, if you say we're going to provide, 1,000 meals, that 1,000 people have been fed or 1,000 people will have healthy food. And so you want to think about how do you build in different types of benchmarks where you're looking at what some people may think of as sort of measuring fuzzy things. So thinking about and integrating into how are you measuring improved relationships with maybe the legislator or the mayor, or how some constituents are feeling more empowered as leaders, and recognizing that that's not easy, but just because something isn't easy to measure doesn't mean that it shouldn't be measured. And unfortunately, it's too common that we tend to just measure things that are easy to measure. But again, that progress can be hard. And so when you're thinking about this type of evaluation, you really want to think about, helping, first of all, being clear about what success looks like. And that success is sort of building that capacity rather than necessarily policy outcomes. Yes, having a policy outcome is great, but you want to make sure that your board understands that that may not happen, that your funders may understand that that may not happen, and to really think about what kinds of incremental progress can you measure. And again, it may be that you were able to get a certain number of op-eds printed in the newspaper, or host a certain number of meetings, or a certain number of people come to your meetings. That's important, and that's what we mean by incremental progress. Also important to value flexibility and to recognize that part of advocacy is being nimble, that we have to pay attention to those outside forces. And in many cases for advocacy or policy change, it's being opportunistic and sometimes thinking about, as people say, sort of never letting a crisis go to waste. And as much as we hate that, thinking about, if there is a hurricane or a governor resigns in disgrace and somebody new comes in, how can you sort of put aside what you may have planned to do and think about, okay, what can we do differently now? And that it's important that your funders, that your trustees, that your members recognize that even if that for advocacy, we need to be prepared to have for our map to change, and that the route that that sort of like if you're driving, when you're going on a trip, your GPS may re-navigate and may change your route based on traffic, based on accidents, things like that. And in advocacy, in many ways, that's what we want. We don't want to just stay on the same route, knowing that it's congested. We have that red line of, of craziness, but think about how can we find alternatives. Also recognizing that, again, for advocacy, sometimes we can't easily measure, or we're not going to have easy or something that we can put numbers on. That for advocacy, sometimes we do need to tell those stories. And particularly for things like organizing, when we're talking about leadership development and how people feel empowered, that may be more narrative. And we need to combine both. And we need to combine both metrics and stories and narrative. And again, as Anne talked about, being able to value partnerships is really, really, really important. And recognizing that in some times saying that you're relying on partners, that you're using data from other people, is that have good credible data, that is so much better than you saying, well, we don't really have the capacity to do it. We don't really have the expertise, but we feel like we need to do everything ourselves, so we're going to do it. Being able to recognize and to be able to build those relationships so who you can rely on, who you can call to have questions answered, is really important. And that's, again, part of this tool is thinking about how do you grow your relationships with other organizations so they know when they can, what your strengths are, and when they can come to you as the expert, and when you can go to them. And then again, being really clear early on and setting up those reasonable expectations. Again, whether it's with your funders, whether it's with your board, whether it's with your members. And as some examples of benchmarks, and again, we sort of talked about this, it may be looking at, if you're working on a bill, that rather than looking at success as getting the bill passed, you also may look at, well, how many co-sponsors can you have on the bill? Is there bipartisan support? How many people came to a meeting? How many briefs did you sign on to? How many comments did you get on a particular regulation? And so again, you can be creative and know your work. And we have some sample benchmarks that we can share. There are a lot of resources in the resource list that Anne was talking about, that you don't need to recreate the wheel, but to recognize that we really do want to take into consideration sort of this capacity and not just looking at the policy outcome as success. And again, we have lots more information on our website about including some additional resources on evaluating community organizing. And as promised, here is our contact information where you can go to our website to see our tools or call us or email us for technical assistance with any of the evaluation capacity work, but also if you have questions about the types of advocacy itself and where that line is between advocacy and lobbying, or what can you do as an organization using federal funds, or how can you get involved in an election and stay within the confines of a C3. And so we are here as a resource. And so I will now turn it back to Anne to talk a little bit more and then take questions.
Thanks, Abby. That was great. Yeah, we have 15 minutes left for questions. I did have one other slide I forgot, but I'll just mention it, that essentially you could do this if you decided you want to do it as a group or you want to do it for yourself, for your own organization. You can pick kind of periodic times that you want to be able to measure what's happening. So say you do a baseline measure, you do all of them, and then a year later, you have everybody do the same thing again and see if your scores have improved. So if you've spent time working on a particular issue, or you've worked on community education, or if you've got activities going on that you know are building your capacity and that are helping you do your job better, that certainly takes some time to go back and retest. And again, it does not take long. I think that was sort of our goal, is we took a lot of questions out after the pretest to really try and just capture what we thought was essential. But this is sort of you do the assessment first, get the scores, review the resources, kind of look at how you want to do this, and then retest like a year later or 6 months, how much you decide. So we don't have any questions in the box right now, but please feel free to ask any questions, type anything in, and we will go ahead and answer those. And this just is to give you sort of the goals and outcomes of what we're hoping to use this for over time. So if there aren't any questions, we'll give it a couple more minutes here. Nope. So as Abby said, they're available to answer specific questions about the role, and we're available to help with the other parts of this and to help you go through this. If you wanted us to walk you through with your group, we would be happy. Oh, Roxanne. Okay. Let's see here. Roxanne, I see you have a question, and we're just going to... Where is it?
There we go. Does anyone see where the clicker is? Can't figure out how to click.
Oh, here. Failure.
All right, there we go. Roxanne, can you type it into the chat box, because we don't see, there's no way to promote you to be able to talk. Also, Carlin, we also see that you have typed in. We don't have the ability to give you access to talk right now.
So if you guys could just type in, type it in the message box, go down to the panel.
And you can type in either Q&A or chat.
There we go. Okay, so one question is, are there regional resources that we can connect with to walk through our existing council through this process? We are happy to do this with you. I don't know where you are in the region. Pittsburgh. Okay. So yeah, we would be happy to walk through this and do it with you if that would be easier, and then we can kind of explain. Oh, Indiana. Okay. Yeah. I mean, we can do this virtually pretty easily on Zoom, and so that is certainly something we're willing to offer. And just contact us offline and send us an email. We can set up a time to walk your group through it. And And so another question from Susan, we've said, do you have any suggestions for parameters for who would participate in your survey? So I think it's really not a question we can answer easily, but whoever is heading up that group is probably in the best position to answer. I would recommend, if you have people who are playing a leadership role within the group, that you at the very least have them complete it, or complete the sections that you think are most relevant to them. You could certainly have your entire group do it. Everybody may not want to participate. It kind of depends on the size of your group and the level of engagement. So I would hesitate to say have everyone do it, because they may not even have enough knowledge to fill out some of it. But certainly if you've got kind of a leadership team, that I would recommend starting with that leadership team. And then Heather, you said you have resources available for starting a new food policy group. Yes, we do have resources. And on our website, if you go to foodpolicynetworks.org, there is a resource database there that's searchable. There's a toolbar on the left-hand side, and it's really easy to go and search. You can do keywords, or you can do the filter system. And we're happy to also, if you have, there's 1,000 resources on there. It can be a little bit overwhelming, and happy to help you find the ones that are most appropriate for your group. So again, feel free to contact us. My email is apalmer6@jhu.edu. And we'll send out a link to the webinar afterwards with the recording and the resource list. And when we do that, you can also just respond to that. And Lane has asked, any recommendations for how to walk the line of advocacy when your FPC is government-based? We're new within the past year and a half and are trying to figure out our suite of available policy tools without falling too much into advocacy like a nonprofit food policy council would. So Abby, I'm going to turn that one over to you, if you can answer that.
Sure. So I think that's a really great question. And I think, again, it's thinking about advocacy in a really broad context. And in many cases, telling stories about who your food council is and what it does, and not assuming that people know, that people understand. And so I think, in many ways, that what often seems like, oh, well, that's too basic, or everybody knows that. Don't assume that. And particularly for, an organization where you feel like, where it's, heavily federally funded, where you're concerned about, not stepping over that line, of really starting with talking about who you are and what your mission is. And we're part of an effort working with to encourage more groups and particularly encouraging board members of organizations to think about their role in advocacy. And it's called Stand for Your Mission, because so much of what advocacy is really talking about what you're doing and why you have a council. And, the piece of advocacy that I think gets all the attention is, again, sort of when we're trying to close the deal, when it's talking about a particular piece of legislation or working on a particular regulation. But really but before that can happen, and as I think, one of the windows that Anne was talking about, is that there needs to be an appetite for change, and people need to even recognize that there's an issue. And so that's one area that I think can be really powerful, is to have different people in the community tell stories, share information, and that's one really good way to start.
Susan, I just want to note your response, because I think it's really an interesting idea. You said, I envision this being used in a series of circles. Leadership team, working groups, partner organizations, each could inform different questions and measure different capacities. And Abby, I don't know if you've had experience with groups doing it like that, but that sounds like a really great idea to me.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And we've seen groups use the tools in very different ways. And again, sometimes it's groups are using it and they want one person to do it because they're trying to get information so they can write a proposal and say, we need help to do X, Y, and Z. But sometimes it really is a way to help organizations come together and really talk about the organization and provide a way for people to get more involved. And I think having, and it would be interesting using it in circles like this and having different teams either take different components of it and then share that information, or have the different teams take it and see how different they are, and that the leadership team may perceive things very differently than a particular working group or a partner organization. And so, there's really no wrong way to do it. It's really to think about how, sort of, what are you looking to do, and what kind of conversations do you want to sort of spawn? What kind of conversations do you want to start, and how can this come into play?
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the things I just want to note too is that we actually went through and really picked some very specific questions related to equity and inclusion, and how does that get measured at that community level. And we did the same thing for using systems approaches. We found some questions that we thought were a great reflection of our groups taking a systems approach, and what does that mean, and then included those in the toolkit. So we've got a way of sort of gauging, are people actually trying to employ systems approaches, or do we just say we're working on the food system, which is different than actually using system science or systems thinking to inform our process. So I wanted to just bring that up as well. Any other questions? No? Okay, great. So I will thank Abby. Abby, this was fabulous. Thanks so much.
It was great.
Yeah.
And thanks to all of you for the great work that you're doing.
And thanks to all the participants. It was great to have you join us today. And we'll, as we said before, we'll send out the recording, and then we also will send out the resource list so you can get a handle on that. It is also available on a PDF form on the website as well. So thanks again. Bye, everybody.